What belongs to God is that which has his image. Well, any Jew knows of the first century that we bear the image of God. People bear the image of God. Jesus isn't saying, go pay your taxes. He's saying, you bear God's image. You belong to God in your entirety. And people must have walked away dumbfounded, thinking, man, we thought we had him. And he turns this thing around on us and shows us that because we are in the icon of God, we owe God everything we have, all that we are. The totality of our being belongs to God because we are his image bearers. So this word icon is very, very important. When it talks about Christ being the icon, the image of God, it is referring to him being a representation of God, a likeness of God, but in some context in Greek literature at the time, it was someone who bore the full responsibility and authority of whoever was being sent, or whoever was sending them. A messenger could come, an ambassador could come, and they would make decisions and bear the full authority of the person that had sent them. And that's what we see with Christ. Christ bears the image of God. He is the representation of who God is. But he is the physical representation of who God is. It says he is the image of the invisible God. God does not have a physical form. The Old Testament is very clear on that. Even when there's some kind of a manifestation of him and people can see him, there is still this idea that he does not have a physical form the way we have physical forms. Jesus incarnates who God is because he is God. And then it goes on to say that he is the, what are some of the values of this, the incarnation, the fact that God becomes man? Well, of course, one of the implications of God becoming man in Christ is his ability to sympathize with humanity. I don't exactly know how that works. I don't know exactly what Christ knows and experiences that does not translate to God the Father, but from our perspective, he is a more able intercessor for us because he has experienced what humanity has experienced. Christ is the unique God-man. You know what? There's no one else in the universe that is like Christ. No human being also possesses the fullness of deity. But think about this. Neither of the other two persons of the Trinity, namely the Father and the Spirit, possess full humanity like Christ does. Christ is completely unique. Christ explains the Father in a way that the Old Testament law and the prophets did not. Let's flip over real quickly to John 1:18, and you probably are familiar with this verse. In fact, it's really interesting to read Colossians and to see how much that relates to what some of the things that John says in John chapter 1. John 1:18. Well, what is the value of God becoming man in the person of Jesus Christ? Colossians. In fact, John. I'm going to back up to verse 16 because he's going to use this term also, and I think we talked about this last week. This idea of fullness. John 1:16. For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace he has lavished us with his grace. Verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. And then verse 18 reaffirms this idea. No one has seen God at any time. God does not have a physical form. The only begotten God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him. So Christ, as the incarnation of God, explains God in a way that we would not otherwise have been able to understand. The word there in John 1:18 is the word exegesis, from which we get the word exegesis. Christ exegetes the Father, explains his will, his truth, and his word as crystal clear as can be explained. One commentator said that Christ is the projection of God on the canvas of our humanity and the embodiment of the divine in the world of men. Christ is also said in verse 15, we're going back to Colossians 1:15, he's also said to be the firstborn, and we'll talk about this phrase, this idea a little bit later on in verse 18 when we get to that next service. But this idea of being firstborn refers to the resurrection of Christ. We also see that in Revelation 1:5. In fact, yeah, I do have a little note about that. It points to the priority of Christ. It points to the primacy of Christ, that he is in the first place. It points to the supremacy of Christ. And it also points to his resurrection. It's interesting. We watched several seasons ago, and we haven't caught a season of The Apprentice since then, but we watched a Celebrity Apprentice several seasons ago because we were kind of interested in some of the celebrities. Did anybody watch Apprentice? Okay, good. One person. A couple of people. Okay, good. A couple of people. But you know what it's about, Donald Trump with his funny hair and the whole thing. But it was interesting in this particular season, you have all these celebrities, people who have made a name for themselves in their particular field. But you also have the Don, and you have his two image bearers, his son and his daughter there. And they would it's kind of like the economic trinity here. I mean, and they would, what was interesting though is one of the teams would be doing a project of some kind, and Ivana would come on the scene, and she kind of bore the full weight and authority of her father. In this situation where you have these celebrities, again, people who are independently wealthy on their own right, they have made a name for themselves in their own field, but she comes in, and there's a little bit of fear of the Don, because the Don's daughter is right there, or the Don's son is right there, and those individuals bear the weight, bear the authority of Donald Trump. Not a real precise example, but we do have this in our own context. Individuals who bear the full weight of the person who is sending them, and Christ does that as well. In many cultures, even today, the firstborn is given special authority and privileges. This is something we've gotten away from in America. But in the same way, Christ inherits the possessions of the Father, and that puts him over all of creation. He's not on a rung between this ladder from heaven to earth, from humanity to divinity. He is over all things. And as a preface to the Great Commission, if you recall, after Jesus is risen from the dead, and before he ascends into heaven, he tells his disciples this. He says, the Great Commission, but his prelude to that is by claiming and by proclaiming, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay, that sets the entire stage for the church age. This world does not belong to the devil. It does not belong to sinners, even though it seems like the pagans have taken over and are going to run things their way. He says all authority in heaven and earth has been given to Christ. He is supreme. Let me get back to the outline here. He is the representation of God, is what you can fill in the blank there. He is the representation of God over creation. And it makes us think, what image do we have in our mind about Christ? Do we think of him as the little baby in the manger? Do we think of him as the wandering preacher? Or do we acknowledge that he has authority over all the world and that we are as servants of his? And as he is the representative of God, we have the right to be representatives of God in our various spheres of activity. Something else about this that I find remarkable, and I think we'll discuss this as we go, is one of the things the Colossians are struggling with was, what is the value of the physical stuff? That's what the false teachers are saying. Physical stuff is bad. Spiritual stuff is good. Physical stuff is always evil. It's spiritual. We got to unlock the spiritual capacities of human beings from their material, physical, bodily form. One thing about Christ entering into the material order is that he redeems it. He says physical stuff can be good as long as it is used for God. The fact that God entered in the material order and took flesh upon himself means that God's creation is important. Physical things are important. It's not bad as long as we use it properly. And I think we forget that sometimes too. So Christ is supreme over creation. The fact that Christ is supreme over creation, over the physical order, that he became part of the physical order as God's representation, means that brings some worth to all we do in the physical realm. So Paul discusses that Christ is the supreme representation of God over creation in verse 15. He goes on in verse 16 to explain that Christ is supreme over creation because he is the instrument of creation. I'll give you the fill in the blank right at the beginning. I missed it last time. He is the instrument of creation. That's our second point there. Verse 16. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. So God created, what it says earlier in that verse, the word by. And I have the word by. I'm going to underline, we're going to do a little study on prepositions here in this verse and in the next verse. By, for by him. By means of him. The word by usually points to some kind of an instrumentality. By means of Christ, God created all things. Christ was intimately involved in the creation of the created order. Christ is the Word from John 1:3, which God spoke all things into existence. And John picks up on this idea in John 1. You know, in the beginning was the Word, the very Word of God, but that Word is not some divine, esoteric, Greek philosophical construct. The Word is a person. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without that Word, nothing was made that was made. Getting back to Colossians 1:16, notice the different terms, the different items, that Christ was instrumental in creating that Paul points out. He says he created both the heavens and the earth. Everything in heaven and everything on earth. If you like this kind of stuff, if you like literary kind of figures of speech, this is what they call a merism. M-E-R-I-S-M. When someone will use two extremes and imply everything on those extremes as well as in between. And of course, remember, for the first century Jew, when they hear heaven and earth, they're thinking the totality of everything that was ever created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's Moses' way of saying God created everything. So Jesus wasn't just involved in working on this. He didn't have a side project. He wasn't subcontracted to work on this or that or the other. Christ was instrumental in the creation of the heavens and the earth. The whole thing. Interestingly, visible and invisible. Remember, this goes back to this idea of spiritual versus material. Material things are not bad because God created them and Christ was instrumental in the creation of them. They have been misused. Physical things are misused. But they are intended for good because they were created by Christ. And then he lists, in verse 16, he lists all these things, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities. I have a little chart here on the handout because these, he does this elsewhere. Ephesians 1:21, he kind of lists out these rulers, authorities, powers, dominions, and as I show you there too, 1 Peter 3:22 does this as well. Some people have taken this to be this ladder. These were code words for that ladder of angelic or semi-deity kinds of individuals. You know, you start at the bottom of the rung and you work all the way up between humanity and deity in the early Gnostic system or in some strains of intertestamental Judaism. And Jesus is kind of, they say that Jesus is kind of right on the middle of that ladder. Because he has some God and he has some man. He has some connection with that pleroma, that divine essence, but he also has physical stuff, physical human stuff. He's half man, half God. That's what they were thinking. He's right there kind of on the middle of that ladder of angels and thrones and powers and dominions and authorities. Paul says, you know what? Take your chart and throw it out the window because Christ is over all of it. Paul says in Ephesians 1:21,